Passover is a time we are instructed to personally examine our own lives. The Bible gives an example of a man who was forced by virtue of events to take personal custodianship of his own life. He didn't volunteer for the job. He didn't seek out the responsibility for personal gain or acclaim. He simply conducted his life in a manner that God had instructed him, and he accepted that. But in the process, he was forced to take personal ownership over his life and conduct. He not only was forced to see himself as he really was, but he was forced to see his Creator, God, as he really was as well. Recently, we were privileged to hear a biography of Job given by Mr. Bob Fay back a couple of months ago. That sermon was very informative and for the most part gave us a lot to consider about the book and the actual personage of the book of Job. But today, I'd like to look at one particular aspect of the book of Job. Not necessarily about Job himself, but to concentrate on what the book instructs and who it may be directed toward. Since Job is referred to elsewhere in the Bible, we have to understand that the book is not only legitimately a part of the Bible, it's just kind of back there someplace. No, it's part of the Bible. And what we read there in Job is an account of the life of a man who actually lived, and not just a quaint story. What I'd like to address today is simply to encapsulate message of the book written to us, particularly now as we approach Passover. If we examine what the book of Job tells us, and there's a definite message aimed directly to us, you and me, we will come to appreciate why we're brought to understand the painful lesson Job was to learn when we look at that book. It's a message that we need to understand above all else. And my title is this. What else? We are Job. We are Job. That's my title. Now, why would I say that? For example, probably none of us have ever had boils all over our body. All right? None of us have ever suffered the death of all of our children. Probably not. None of us have ever lost all of our property in one fell swoop. Or none of us have ever had friends who have tried to help us but only succeeded in alienating us, maybe because we refused to listen. None of us ever had anything like that. Nothing like that. That's recorded here in the book of Job. Nothing like that has ever happened to us personally. Who am I kidding? Who am I kidding? Most of us have had all of these things, or like events similar to this happen to us, or brethren, or even physical family, either totally or in part. Things very much like what is described here in the book of Job. So let's look at some of the things that occurred to Job here as recorded in the Bible. Starts out, Job's children. The book of Job opens with a description of Job dealing with his children and their activities. And we can probably identify with some of this. Who of us here have not had some serious concern about their children? Some of us, sometimes, the activities of our children and their friends have been a major concern of parents here, sitting here. Yes, even our children. If you're honest with yourself, you look back when your children were young and even now, as young children and even after they mature to adulthood, at a time when we may exercise no particular control over them. Like after they're 14, okay? No control over them. As they grew older, we may wonder who they associate with. We may wonder what their activities are, when there may have been a question of what those activities were. In many cases, our concern may not have been something that we could directly address with our kids. You can't go to your kids sometimes and say, we heard that you were at such and such a place tonight. I want to know the truth. Okay, you can't do that all the time. So what did we do? We did as Job did. Job prayed for his children. That's probably what we did. Job didn't know exactly what their activities were. When you read that account there in the first chapter, he didn't know exactly what was going on, but his concern inspired him to pray for them and even sacrifice for them, not unlike many of us. And our concern for our children, when we may not have felt free to address our concerns directly to them, because we might have offended them, we may have been wrong, who knows, about a problem that may have been a part of their activities. A little uneasy about addressing those things directly to our children. Now, there are times when we leave that up to God, and there's nothing more that we can do about that at the risk of overt interference with our children. So Job had 10 children. Turn to Job 1 to begin with. We'll deal with that mostly right there in the early chapter of Job. Job 1, verse 2. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. That's a pretty good-sized family. Job 1, verse 4. And his sons went and feasted in their houses. Job 1, verse 4. Every one on his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. Family affair. Verse 5. And it was so when the days of their feasting were gone about that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning. Job was uneasy about what was going on. He offered burnt offerings according to the number of them for all of them. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. So this feasting that Job's 10 children indulged in was not something they necessarily consulted their father about. Look, Dad, we're going out and we're going to the feast. No, that wasn't what they said. They didn't consult their father about that. That feasting may possibly be referred to these days as something that we have learned to call partying. Partying. They were out partying, and who knows what that was all about. Job apparently, he didn't really know. He didn't know what was going on. And this was just one aspect we're told of regarding the relationship between Job and his children, his offspring. So this went on. Then after this came the crisis, the death of all of Job's children. One of the first things that happened here was that Job suffered the death of all of his children. One of the first trials that happened to Job here. The death of all of his children. How much deeper can Satan bury his dagger into one who is a parent? Not just 1 or 2 of Job's children, but the whole family, wiped out all 10. How many times have we prayed concerning the well-being of our children, and it seemed God wasn't listening? Most all of us have experienced devastating things happen to our children, even death. We may have all, or many of us, experienced the death of some of our children. And it seemed God wasn't listening to our prayers. It happened to Job. And similar circumstances may have happened to any of us. Job, after all, prayed to God in their behalf on a regular basis for their well-being. He did that on a regular basis. I'll give you just one personal example here. My younger sister and her husband, just a few years ago, their 2 sons, both in their mid-20s. I don't know, I may have told some of you this. They had attended college, the boys had attended college, and were well on their road to a mature and successful adulthood. That is until around about the year 2000. The boys. The year 2000. Both boys were killed instantly in a 4-way intersection by a semi, which blew through a red light, T-boned their vehicle. One day they were a happy family, and the next day their family had been decimated. The Job-like examples can happen often quickly and surprisingly to anyone. It happens. Job 1, verse 18. While he was yet speaking, here's the Job example. There came also another, and he said, your sons and your daughters, they were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the four corners of the house. And it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I am escaped to tell you. Verse 20, then Job arose, he rent his mantle, and shaved his head, fell down upon the ground, and worshipped. Job's response, well, it happens. Then Job proceeded to kneel down and pray to God. Job obviously took refuge in the only comfort he could recognize, God's presence. And Job may have uttered the words, well, how can it get any worse? Well, it could, and it did. Now here's a good one. Our property. That's the next thing that happened. Have any of you ever had a fire that destroyed your home? I hope not. How many of you have ever lost property or have had it confiscated by the government for taxes or fined or for some other reason? I hope not there as well. Maybe you've had to sell your home at a loss for some reason. I understand they do that in Chicago these days. But it's not just your home. It may have been other property. Remember, your property things that you own. You may have had a car wreck, and most all of us have had some kind of an automobile accident, wrecked our vehicles. Or maybe it was a storm that destroyed all kinds of elements of your property. Our physical property is very important to us. I think you'll admit that. Maybe your computer crashed. That's important. Of course, God instructs us not to be overly concerned about that because he will provide for us. After all, he provides for all nature around us, birds, flowers, the air we breathe, and more. But all the physical blessings that we enjoy as a result of blessings of Abraham, that's all important to us personally. All the conveniences, electricity, rapid transportation, instant communication. So, looking back earlier this year, we've had a tough winter. We had a water break in the neighborhood. We were without water for at least a half a day. We were without water for a half a day. Maybe not a big deal. What's he crying about? But a couple of weeks after that, we lost the use of our electricity. It started at 7:30 p.m., and lasted until 1:30 a.m. in the morning. And this may not be a big deal, but it was a little bit more serious than the water, particularly when the temperature is hovering around zero outside. Okay, the electricity goes off. So we were very thankful when ComEd restored the power and our lights and our furnace began to operate again. Our home began to warm up again. We only lost about 10 degrees, and we were glad that things were warming up again. So we as human beings put a lot of stock in our comfort, our well-being, and our survival, our conveniences, our property. That's all very important to us. Even very recently, there's been a lot of flooding all over the country, and particularly important to all of us, even locally. I understand over in Freeport, they're telling that the flooding over there is the worst it's been since the year 1933, okay? Didn't affect us at all, but a lot of Freeport is low-lying area, and as well as in Rockford. I believe God has spared most of us in this rampant flooding crisis. So here was Job's experience. Everything was working fine. All of his employees and his help were on the job. Everything was working smooth there. Then all at once, all kinds of disaster hit Job's property. Job 1:14, all at once. And that's usually the way disasters hit, all at once. Job 1:14, there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. Everything was running normal back on the farm. But then all at once, all kinds of disaster hit Job's property. Once again, all at once. That's the way disasters happen. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yes, they've slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I escaped to tell you. There was some kind of an invasion from neighboring area there. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I'm the only one that escaped to tell you. There was a big weather disaster happened. Something fell from the sky, fire from the sky. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, verse 17, and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yes, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I'm the only one who escaped to tell you more invasion from the neighboring area there. How can this be? Have we at one time or another uttered these words? How can this be? How can this be? And that's just the start. Job had lost everything. His family, his employees, everything he owned was gone. Then, of course, he hadn't lost everything. Then, of course, there was sickness. Job was overcome with sickness. Now, that never happens to any of us, does it? Are we kidding ourselves? It happens all the time. As we get older, particularly, we're all a time bomb, waiting for sickness. Job's sickness was boils. Job only had boils covering his whole body. Now, that's pretty serious when you think about Job. Most of us have never suffered anything remotely close to that, boils all over our body, or have we? Is boils more serious than being stricken with some of our more modern-sounding illnesses? Cancer, heart issues, lungs? That's all pretty serious, I'd say. Some of you may have had to undergo all kinds of ongoing, unpleasant, and expensive treatment for even several years at a time. And even then, maybe you weren't completely healed when it was all over, or you may still be dealing with it. Heart, lungs, joint replacements. Our bodies, our physical cells wear out. We're walking time bombs. We have brethren even now with such devastating illnesses. I could probably name a whole list of illnesses that may have touched our lives. I've just mentioned a few there. To any of you who have experienced any kind of serious illnesses, believe me, when these things happen to you, it was just as devastating to you as were the boils that plagued Job. Now when we're afflicted, we don't utter the words, I'm sure glad I don't have boils, like Job. In fact, we don't even think about Job. When we're attacked by some affliction that God allows Satan to inflict upon us, and in fact, because it's you or me suffering, it would be devastatingly more serious than anything we see here concerning Job. It's just on paper, Why? Because it's us. It's me. Now, that's serious. Job isn't even on our minds in our personal afflictions. I'll ask you this. Were Job's afflictions any worse than some I've mentioned that have happened to any of you? Absolutely. Those afflictions of Job's were worse. But only to Job. Then there are all of our friends who try to help. Let's look at the attitude of Job's friends. They loved Job. All of them were well-meaning. He had 3 good friends, at least at the beginning. Sometimes it just doesn't help. Sometimes our friends become discouraged in trying to help us. Sometimes they just tire of trying to encourage us because it may look like we aren't listening. We just aren't listening. Maybe it's because we may not be particularly receptive to them. Friends then even sometimes become unintentionally uninterested in helping us anymore. That can happen among friends. That's the way friends are. Then it may seem our friends just give up on us. Does any of this sound familiar? Sure it does. Job's friends even desperately resorted to blaming Job at the end there for everything that was happening to him. Job just won't listen. He just won't listen. But it was primarily because they had no concept of how God sometimes works his will. God was dealing with Job in a special way. The friends didn't understand. So anyway, you may look at it. A very important purpose of the message of the book of Job really seems to be a message directed at all of us, directed to us all, for the same reason it was directed at Job. So let's keep that in mind. In a very real way, the message we see directed to Job is a message directed to each one of us personally. So let's look again at how the book of Job opens. It seems God was having a meeting of sorts, maybe concerning his human creation. We'll look at that in a minute. Job 1, verse 6. He was having a meeting. But you see who was hanging around. God was discussing various godly subjects, obviously, including, or maybe particularly, his creation of life, the lives of those he loves most, his potentially spiritual children. And once again, you see who was hanging around. He's always hanging around. Anytime he sees some element of righteousness, there he is. That would be our adversary, the accuser, Satan. Always there, hanging around. Job 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before God, before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Oh, who's that back there? Oh, it's just Satan. In Job's case, God used Satan to refine Job's righteousness in some way. The Lord, verse 7, Job 1, verse 7, and the Lord said unto Satan, where did you come from? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. Oh, I'm just lurking around, just kind of seeing what I can see, say, and do. But even though Satan is the god of this world, just between you and me, he's not in charge. But nonetheless, God does use Satan. As I mentioned, in Job's case, God uses Satan to refine Job's righteousness in some way. The purpose may have been to reveal to Job something about himself that Job was not getting. God may not have been achieving that purpose by providing all of Job's physical needs in every way, even in Job's obedience. You recall when Satan said, well, sure, Job maintains his loyalty to you. Why wouldn't he? You bless him in every way because he's loyal and submissive to you, even righteous. But just you turn him over to me and we'll soon find out who he's loyal to and who he loves. You just turn him over to me. The answer God gave may not be the answer most of us want to hear when things like this happen to us. Sure, go ahead, test him out. Sure, go ahead, test him out. We don't want that, but sometimes it happens. Job 1, verse 8. The Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that fears God and hates evil? That Satan answered. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he has on every side? Have you not blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in his hand? But I'll bet you put forth your hand now and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face. Yes, God used Satan to refine in some way Job's righteousness. Satan just dared him to. He will do that to each of us as well. It can happen to each and all of us, and probably will in some way, shape, or form. Satan had his eye on each of us. In his quest to save you, God will use sometimes the antics of Satan to refine us and solidify our conversion. Remember, Job was just going on from day to day, living his life righteously, according to the righteous pattern he had learned from God. He had learned well. When God was seeing that Job's righteousness in some way wasn't complete all by itself. Job did not see himself correctly. Job did not see God correctly. Then, as you recall, Satan wandered on the scene, as we've just reviewed. Satan was just hanging around. God knew Satan. He knows Satan. He knew him from the very beginning. He knew that if he turned him loose on Job, that he wouldn't stop until he had done all that he could. What Satan didn't take into consideration was that God also knew Job. He knew that he would hold on until the very end, if necessary. He had heard the instruction to endure to the end. Job knew that he was to endure to the end. He that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. Using that process, God knew that Job's conversion would be refined to such a point that he would see himself as he really was, totally dependent upon his Creator, and that Job would finally see God, his Creator, as he really was and is as well, creating a wonderful, compatible relationship between the two of them. And God was confident that would be brought about by the natural antics of Satan himself, using Satan's very tools through all his hate and accusations. As we endure to the end, God will accomplish this in each of us. We will finally see ourselves as we really are, and we will then actually see and understand God, our Creator, as he really is as well. Now, as we have heard in the earlier message, we review this process every spring at Passover. One of the main areas we are to cover personally every year at this time is to examine yourself. Not to examine somebody else. Examine yourself. Why is this necessary? Why can't we simply take the bread and wine representing Christ's body and blood and then wash each other's feet? No big deal. Because we have to further refine the ongoing process of the establishment of humility in our life. It's a lifelong process. Humility before God in honor to him, and humility before each other in mutual respect. That keeps us from succumbing to the same fate that Satan followed. Satan had no ongoing exercise of humility. Satan had already, long before, rebelled against that aspect of life. As a result, his main purpose in life was to not become humble before God, but to become the power that was to take over the job of God. That was Satan. We have to guard against that. Now we all know what the result of this exercise was, and not one of us wants to fall in that category. One of the purposes of Passover is to help us never get close to that attitude of Satan. That humility we learn is necessary for us in understanding our relationship with Jesus Christ and God our Father. That humility we learn in understanding ourselves and our relationship to God and who God is. We then begin to understand our need to totally rely on God and develop an ongoing relationship in submission to our Creator. We renew each year this at Passover, that humility and our need to totally rely on God in developing that relationship with him. And in addition to that, it's more than just humility. The book of Job teaches us to see ourselves as we really are, as we totally are, totally dependent upon God, and to see God as he really is as well, as our great Creator, but also our constant, loving, caring, trusting companion. Job 42. Turn to the last book in Job there. Job 42, verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from you. Who is he that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered words that I understood not. Job had I'm this and I'm that, but I didn't really understand what was going on. Things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. I didn't know what I was talking about. Here, verse 4, I beseech thee, I will speak, I will demand of thee, and declare you unto me. Verse 5, Job 42, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Wherefore, here we go, he saw himself as well. I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. When Job finally saw God as he was, it caused him to see himself in reality as well. Remember, your Christian life is in a very real way a Job-like experience. Job profited in every way, physically and spiritually, very much by this experience. when he finally allowed God to reveal himself so he could really see God and his purpose, then God revealed himself to Job. And he'll do the same thing for us. But we have to open the door constantly. When we allow that to happen, when we finally allow God to reveal himself to us, the process will cause us to see ourselves as we really are as well. That comes from God. It's not something we do. In addition to the Passover helping us to experience humility, when we partake of the bread and wine, we symbolically consume the very life of Christ. So in closing, may we all benefit by Job's experience and our own Job-like experiences in life, so that in enduring to the end, and we're instructed to do that and encouraged to do that, we may not just experience a renewed physical life, but that we may then be privileged to prepare to enter into permanent spiritual life that God has planned for each of us. Remember that in a very real way, we are Job.